On January the 1st, the EU announced it would be withholding more than €1 billion in structural funds for Hungary due to ongoing disputes with Viktor Orbán's Fidesz government over rule of law concerns. The EU has played this card before, but this loss of funds has hit Hungary at a time when its government has little room for manoeuvre, with a budget deficit running at more than 4.5% of GDP, and the country falling into a technical recession at the end of last year, the second time it's done so in the space of 3 years. So in this video, we're going to look at why Hungary's economic challenges are becoming increasingly difficult, and whether they could jeopardize Prime Minister Viktor Orbán's re-election hopes in 2026. We're getting remarkably close to 1 million subscribers, and currently 72% of you haven't yet subscribed. So lend us a hand and subscribe today. So let's get straight into it. Inflation has obviously been a problem for incumbent governments across the world, but in part because of conspicuously weak wage growth, Hungarians have suffered more than most, with Hungary seeing the steepest decline in real wages in Europe. In an attempt to keep voters happy, Orbán has dramatically increased government spending. In 2022, just before the general election, Orbán handed out extra payments for pensioners, scrapped income tax for younger people, and offered grants to families to renovate their homes, measures worth about 1% of GDP combined, or about $2 billion. His government also extended a generous family benefit regime. That was Orbán's most popular policy among undecided voters, according to a 2020 survey, that now costs nearly 5% of GDP per year. On top of this, according to Reuters, only a quarter of the €12 billion from the EU's COVID recovery fund was actually spent on pandemic-related issues. The rest of the money was spent on other items, including support for ethnic Hungarian diaspora living in Hungary's neighbouring countries who backed him in previous elections. But this spending spree hasn't really worked in improving the cost of living for ordinary Hungarians, in large part because it's been accompanied by steep inflation. In 2023, Hungary's household consumption, adjusted for purchasing power parity, was only 70% of the EU average. This places Hungarians at the bottom of the EU, alongside Bulgarians, with the lowest purchasing power among all member states. Moreover, despite all the extra handouts for pensioners, according to the 2023 Eurobarometer survey by the European Insurance and Occupational Pension Authority, or EIOPA, only 30% of Hungarian consumers, one of the lowest figures in the EU, feel confident that they will have enough money to live comfortably throughout their retirement, presumably because they're anxious that inflation will continue to eat away at their savings. This public spending has instead mainly just pushed the national deficit up to dangerous levels. For context, Hungary's public deficit has already grown steadily since 2015, and especially since the pandemic. In the past 4 years, it's averaged nearly 7% of GDP, and in 2024, the government had to raise its deficit target from 2.9% to 4.5% of GDP, but by June, they'd already gone past it. Hungary's budget deficit is obviously also well above the EU target of 3%, and the country now has the highest debt level among the so-called Visegrad 4, coming in at over 70% of GDP. On top of that, Hungary now spends an inordinate amount of money just servicing this debt, i.e. paying off the interest. In part because Hungary has had to offer relatively high interest rates to attract creditors, Hungary now spends more than 4% of GDP servicing its debt, according to data for 2023, the highest in the EU. The risk for Hungary here is that it gets stuck in a sort of debt doom loop, where it needs to borrow more money to service its debts, which increases servicing costs, which means more borrowing, etc. Anyway, Hungary's questionable fiscal practices have landed it in hot water with the EU multiple times in the past, and Hungary was one of 8 countries reprimanded by the EU last month for breaking the union spending rules. In theory, if Hungary doesn't fix its budget, it could be hit with a fine amounting to 0.1% of GDP every year, although this has never actually happened before. Orbán will have until mid-January to agree on a compromise fiscal plan between 2025 and 2028, with the EU set to give the country bad marks unless the government lowers spending. Without spending cuts, the only way out of this conundrum would be higher taxes or higher growth, but Hungary's economy is currently stagnant and actually entered a technical recession in Q3 of 2024. This is largely as a result of low demand across Europe, with the Hungarian manufacturing sector having a particularly difficult time, especially in the automotive industry, which has seen a 4% output decline in recent months. It's currently hard to imagine Hungary enjoying growth rates high enough to reduce the deficit as a percentage of GDP, and low growth also makes it harder for Orbán to tax his way back to macroeconomic stability, because taxes are always less popular when growth is weak and could slow the economy further. All of this will be exacerbated by the billions of euros worth of mostly EU-funded investments and social spending that have now been cancelled. Of the 6.3 billion euros in total funds frozen by Brussels over concerns about the rule of law, Hungary permanently lost 1.04 billion euros at the beginning of this month, because that specific amount expired if it was unallocated by the end of 2024. On top of that, Hungary is also missing out on 1 million euros each day in EU funding in response to its illegal treatment of asylum seekers. These specific losses now amount to some 200 million euros. That's not all though. There was also a one-off 200 million euro fine imposed in June by the European Court of Justice for breaches of asylum rules and ignoring an earlier judgment, while something like 19 billion euros in post-pandemic recovery funds and other EU resources remain blocked. As part of his so-called economic neutrality policy, Orbán has tried to offset this funding shortfall with investment from Asia, and especially China, which has surged in recent years. Nonetheless, China is Hungary's only 9th most important trading partner, so it's hard to see Chinese investment and trade fully compensating for the lack of funds from Brussels. Finally, what does all this mean for Orbán's electoral prospects? Well, the Hungarian opposition has seized the opportunity to blame Orbán's government for the economic malaise. Peter Magyar, an Orbán ally turned foe, whose teaser party now leads Fidesz in the opinion polls, has attacked what he sees as chronic corruption-inducing misspending by Orbán's government, touring the country and drawing attention to Hungary's under-equipped hospitals, inadequate childcare facilities, and crumbling railway stations. While a full-blown economic crisis looks unlikely, it's hard to see Hungary's economic prospects improving anytime soon, unless Orbán agrees to some sort of compromise with the EU on issues including the rule of law and asylum policy. While Orbán will doubtless try to blame Brussels for Hungary's economic woes, he'll probably struggle if he hasn't fixed either the budget crisis or Hungary's weak growth rates before the next election. We're heading into 2025 with a whole new group of politicians, business leaders, and influential people. The question is then, who'll come out on top? Who is the world's most influential person? That's what we're trying to find out with our most influential person list, which we need your help with. If you head to the link in the description, you can vote for your own personal top 10, helping to shape our overall ranking. Your vote is super important, and voting closes on January the 15th. So do your democratic duty and cast your ballot for the world's most influential person. Also, if you're wondering why we're doing this, it's for the next issue of our magazine, Too Long. That's because the next issue will contain the entire list, as well as fascinating articles about the top 25. Those won't just be boring profiles about each of the people either. There'll be interesting stories about who these people really are, where their power truly resides, and how they wield their influence. If you want to pre-order a copy of the magazine now, you can click the link in the description to pick up a copy. Oh, and if you pick up a premium copy of the magazine, you'll also get access to our internal award ceremony, where the team will first learn and react to your votes live. Plus, you'll get to watch TLDR team members sit down to discuss their lists and fight it out and try and agree for once. Plus, you'll get access to our behind-the-scenes podcast, The Bullpen, and your name printed in the thank you section of the magazine. Anyway, find out more, cast your vote, or order a copy by clicking the various links in the description.